Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive into technology history. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most iconic format wars in history, the Betamax versus VHS battle. This fight for dominance would shape the future of home entertainment and leave a lasting legacy in the tech world forever. In this video, we're going to explore the technical details of the market dynamics and the strategic decisions that led to the victory of VHS over Betamax. So let's dive in. So our story begins in the mid-1970s. In May of 1975, Sony introduced Betamax and pioneered the concept of home video recording. Betamax had a resolution of 333 by 486, which, not very impressive, but at the time was very high quality. The tape size was also smaller than VHS, at just about 6 inches by 3 3/4 inches, but it only had an initial recording time of an hour, which was later extended to 1.5 hours, but was still too short for a lot of major movies. It had a unique dual video head design, which gave it that improved picture quality, and it had better tape transport mechanisms, which increased the audio quality. So Betamax was a pretty superior format when it came to picture and sound, but just a year later, in 1976, JVC would bring out their VHS, or Video Home System. VHS had a slightly lower resolution of 320 by 486, but it had a crucial advantage of an initial recording time of 2 hours. This was later extended to 6 hours by using thinner tape and slower tape speed settings, which meant you could record multiple movies on one tape. It had a simpler single video head design and slightly inferior audio quality, but it was still acceptable for most users. The real difference between these two formats, though, other than a slight edge in picture and sound quality for Betamax, was the recording time. This was particularly important for people who wanted to record full-length movies and TV shows, which was very popular in the 70s and into the 80s and into the 90s. I know that we had many a bootleg HBO recorded VHS tape in my house. You could find them on every street corner. It was a very popular thing to put a VHS tape in and record what was on your screen. So at the initial stage of sale, while Betamax's higher video quality was undeniable, the ability to record entire movies on a single tape is what proved to be the most attractive feature for major consumers. This, also coupled with the lower cost of VHS players, started to tilt the scales in the favor of VHS very early on. The reason for the lower cost of VHS players was a very smart move by JVC's marketing and product team. They had an open license strategy to VHS, which meant that multiple manufacturers could produce VHS-compatible devices, which drove down prices and increased market penetration. On the other hand, Betamax was owned by Sony, and they kept that license in-house. So only Sony was making Betamax players, there was no competition in the market, and it made them more expensive, and it made VHS a much more popular option for the cost-conscious consumer. And like most format wars, this one moved pretty quickly. In 1975, Betamax was dominating as the only option. 1976 into 1977, VHS entered the market, and by 1980, only 3 years later, VHS had already captured 60% of the market. A year later, in 1981, VHS had 75% of the market, and by 1987, VHS controlled 90% of the US market. At this point, the format war was pretty much over. Betamax's proprietary nature really limited its adoption, and that open standard for VHS just allowed for a broader range of devices, more competitive pricing, more options for consumers, and a wide range of different hardware that made VHS a much more popular option if you were going to invest in a format. Now, Hollywood studios did play a role in this format war, but actually a much less significant role than in other format wars like Blu-ray versus HD DVD. Now, initially, studios were releasing films on both formats, but once VHS really started to show that popularity, most of their studios shifted their support directly to VHS because it had a larger market share and it had longer recording times, which made sense when you're distributing movies. For the most part, the biggest supporter of Betamax was Columbia Pictures, which obviously makes sense because they're owned by Sony. On the VHS side, they had Paramount, Warner Brothers, Universal, Disney, and MGM. By the mid-1980s, most new releases were being produced primarily for VHS, and all of the studios other than Sony and Columbia Pictures had made the switch. Now back to cost, this was also a very significant factor, and we talked about that open licensing standard, but I don't know if you realize how big a difference that made. Betamax players were super expensive, often retailing for over $1,000, which in the mid-1980s is an insane cost. On the flip side, VHS players were available for as low as $200 by the mid-1980s, and into the late 80s and early 90s, they only got cheaper. And in addition to the cost of the players, the price of the tapes also greatly influenced consumer decisions. VHS tapes were generally cheaper and more readily available due to the broader support from manufacturers and studios, which made VHS a much more cost-effective option for consumers. So it was kind of a no-brainer. Betamax tapes cost more and had limited availability, and the hardware was 3 to 4 times as much, and VHS tapes were lower cost, cheaper hardware, and wider availability. Betamax was dead in the water. Now, of course, when we talk about a physical media format war, we have to talk about the adult film industry. This is an often overlooked factor in most format wars, but the adult film industry's choice usually ends up being the long-term winner. And in this case, their preference was VHS. The longer recording times and lower production costs made it the format of choice for adult films, and this industry was worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually and played a huge role in the widespread adoption and success of VHS. So by the late 1980s, the outcome of this format war was pretty clear. In 1988, Sony finally gave in and began producing their own VHS players, which effectively meant they were conceding defeat. The shift marked the end of the format war, with VHS emerging as the dominant format. And so in this case, despite Betamax's technical superiority, it came down to affordability, longer recording times, and broader industry support that helped VHS win the war. However, Betamax would not disappear and was actually used for a lot longer than you might think. Sony was producing Betamax units all the way up until 2002, and they were making Betamax tapes until 2016. And you're probably asking, why? That's insane. They had lost the format war 30 years prior, but they were still making tapes. And reality is, although they lost the format war for consumers, because Betamax had a very high quality and had great audio and picture quality, it was widely used by the television industry to keep master recordings of their shows, news broadcasts, documentaries. It was a very popular format in that world of archive video. And to this day, there are many, many, many shows and news recordings which are only available on Betamax format and are slowly being transferred over to newer formats. Hence why Sony was still making those tapes up until 2016. So it's very interesting because, in a Blu-ray versus HD DVD format war, HD DVD just disappeared. It had no use case. But Betamax actually did have this really niche use, and Sony was still making money off it 30 years after they lost one of the biggest format wars in home video history. And ultimately, the whole war here really serves as a reminder that technical superiority alone doesn't guarantee market success. You have to understand consumer needs and have the correct market strategy, something that Sony would smartly adapt to in the early 2000s and into the 2010s when they won the format war this time around with their Blu-ray versus HD DVD. One of the major reasons they won, because they included a Blu-ray player inside their PlayStation 3 system, effectively giving a Blu-ray player to everyone who bought the PS3, while Microsoft charged an extra $200 for their player, which made it harder to access, more expensive. So all the things that killed Betamax were recreated again by Toshiba and Microsoft when they lost the second format war. So Sony learned from their mistakes, came back, and when it came to high definition technology, they knew they couldn't lose this one, and they paid attention to consumer needs and market strategies that they probably ignored for far too long in the Betamax versus VHS format war. So thank you for joining me on this journey through Betamax versus VHS. Make sure you like and subscribe if you want more content like this. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this. And also, feel free to shoot me ideas for more video essays and little mini documentaries like this that you'd like to see me cover. So I appreciate you all watching. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you all soon.